don't usually hang around the podium, but we've got a fixed mic today, so I'll be doing the best I can to stay here. I'm much more sympathetic to people that have lost some hearing over the years. My dad's 85 this year. We just had a birthday party. He can't hear a thing you say. So, or maybe he's just ignoring me. So, John, what word did Kirsten use to describe my talk today? Do you remember in the program? Probably dynamic or captivating. Kirsten, thank you. I've done 1,000 of these talks over the years, and I've always thought they were captivating. But this is the first time anybody's ever described it as captivating, so I certainly appreciate that. And I'm going to talk about summer annuals today, and again, like John's talk, if you guys have questions, please ask them as we go along. If I don't get through all these slides today, that's not the important part. The important part is that you get your questions answered. And I'll be around after the talk to answer questions too if you want to ask about summer annuals or anything else in your system. I really appreciated John's talk today. And it's really an honor to be in this room with two of what I consider the best forage extension specialists in the southeastern United States, and that's John Andre and John Jennings from Arkansas. They're two outstanding forage specialists. So you all are really fortunate to have John Andre here in South Carolina. Unfortunate that he's moved into administration. So, all right, well, let's go ahead and get started here. They didn't ask me to talk about this, but I think it's important to mention this right up front whenever we talk about warm season forages and forage systems. And that's a little bit about water use in agriculture. I don't think we talk enough about that. It's always been a big issue in the western United States, but it's becoming an emerging issue in the eastern United States, even in the humid east where we get plenty of rain in most years. Agriculture worldwide accounts for 80 to 90% of freshwater use. And so people say, well, if we want to cut back on water use, we'll just quit irrigating crops. But it's not quite that simple. 18% of the cropland is irrigated, but that 18% produces 40% of the total production. So it's not as simple as just saying stop irrigating cropland. There's increased competition for water use, and that's always been present in the western United States, but we're starting to see that on the East Coast. We've got population growth, urban expansion, we've got cities that are spreading out, and there's increased competition for that water use, and we also want high quality water for those urban expansion areas. So what's the answer? And I don't really have an answer, right? It's a complicated issue, but in agriculture we've really got to focus on more efficiently utilizing water resources, and that's in both grain-fed and irrigated systems. So we'll have better technology for irrigating water that's going to reduce the amount of irrigation water that we're using. But we also have to improve efficiency of water use in rain-fed systems. And that's going to involve things like better agronomic management. So if we want to have our forage crops in a place that they're able to use water when it comes as rain or as irrigation water. And that means doing a good job with our soil fertility. It means choosing good species to include in our forage system. It means using improved species that have been selected, maybe with genetics for improved water use efficiency, and then using better irrigation technology. So all these things are part of this solution to improved water use in agriculture. I'll grab my water. This is kind of a neat table that was put together by Vivian Allen a number of years ago, and it kind of looks at water use efficiency of different forage crops. We always think of alfalfa as being drought tolerant, and it's certainly drought tolerant. It's got a deep taproot that's able to find water when other crops can't. But it doesn't really make alfalfa very efficient at using water. In fact, it's one of our least efficient water use crops. When we look at alfalfa, it takes about 844 kilograms of water to produce a kilogram of dry matter. If we drop down to the bottom of this table and take a look at something like a Sudan grass or a sorghum species, which would include sorghum Sudans, forage sorghum, and even Johnson grass, we're using about 1/3 as much water to produce a pound of dry matter versus alfalfa. So when we think about water use efficiency in forage cropping systems, thinking about warm season grasses during the summer months that are going to be able to convert that water very efficiently into dry matter is pretty important. Just a little refresher on cool and warm season grasses. Do we have a question? So generally speaking, and we'll mention this in this slide, but protein is going to tend to be lower in our warm season grasses because of the way the grasses are structured, and they're a little bit more efficient at using nitrogen. So we're going to have less total nitrogen and therefore less total crude protein in our warm season species versus our cool season species. I don't know. I don't think so. Right. Okay. All right, so real quick refresher on cool season grasses. We're kind of in what we call the transition zone, especially in the northern part of South Carolina, where we have both cool and warm season grasses. And our cool season grass, probably in this part of the state, is going to be tall fescue. It's going to be our best adapted cool season grass. It's going to have optimal growth around 70 degrees Fahrenheit in terms of leaf temperature. It's going to tend to be more digestible and higher in crude protein and have a longer total growing season. Our warm season grasses, which would include things like Bermuda grass and our summer annual grasses like crabgrass or sorghum Sudans, tend to have optimal growth around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's important to realize that temperature difference in where it has optimal growth or optimal photosynthesis in the leaf blade is going to allow it to be productive during the summer months, when growth of our cool season grasses like orchard grass and tall fescue are going to be limited during the summer months by temperature. Tends to be less digestible and lower in crude protein, and one of the big advantages, it tends to be a lot more drought tolerant, which is important in our forage systems. And it tends to be more efficient at using water. So a warm season grass is going to produce about twice as much dry matter per unit of water used compared to a cool season grass. That's especially important during the summer months when we have limited rainfall, because our warm season grasses are going to be able to convert that rainfall into dry matter during the summer months. This is just a typical growth curve of tall fescue ladino pasture. It's bimodal, so we've got a hump of growth in the spring, a hump of growth in the fall, and then not much going on in the summertime. Even with adequate water, growth during the summertime in our cool season grasses is often limited by high temperatures. So as temperature exceeds 70 degrees Fahrenheit, photosynthesis in cool season grasses becomes very inefficient. And that's kind of where summer annual grasses or even summer perennial grasses come in. They have a much higher ability to grow during the summer months, and they complement cool season grass production very nicely by including them into a system with cool season grass base. So let's get right into it and talk about some of these summer annual grasses. I want to start out with kind of a non-traditional summer annual grass, and that's crabgrass. This is the grass that we love to hate, right? If it's in my wife's flowers, it's definitely a weed. If it's in my pasture, it can be a pretty good forage, actually. It's well adapted to this whole region that we consider the Mid-South. It's kind of an annual, but it acts like a perennial through prolific reseeding. So it has to come back from seed every year, but it's a very prolific reseeder, so it produces a tremendous amount of seed and self-reseeds itself. If we're going to use it in a system, it really needs to be double cropped with a winter annual like John was talking about, annual ryegrass, a cereal like a cereal rye or a wheat, or even an annual clover can work well in this system. It has good yield potential, not as high as Bermuda grass, but where it kind of beats out Bermuda grass is forage quality. Animal performance tends to be higher on crabgrass compared to Bermuda grass, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. There's no prussic acid potential like a sorghum Sudan or a sorghum species would have. Can accumulate nitrates under specific conditions, not real frequently, but under high nitrogen fertilization, we can stimulate nitrate accumulation in crabgrass. So this is Red River crabgrass. This was in the Piedmont of Virginia, and this was our first harvest 60 days after planting. So tremendous dry matter production under good growing conditions with crabgrass. Crabgrass likes a little bit of water, and it also likes nitrogen fertilization. This particular trial was a nitrogen trial, and I'll show you some data from that in a minute. When I first started working with crabgrass, we had kind of one variety out there. It was Red River crabgrass. Since then, we've have about a half a dozen varieties now. Still have Red River. We've got Quick and Big Spreader. We've got Dow's Big River crabgrass, and then one called Mojo from Barenbrug Seed. And in my favor, we had all these in a trials on farms and demos this summer. And probably my favorite still Red River crabgrass. It's nice leafy crabgrass. The Quick and Big has faster growth, quicker emergence, and it gets taller, but it's not quite as leafy as the old Red River crabgrass. The Mojo from Barenbrug Seed looked really good this summer. It's a mixture of Red River and one other proprietary seed from Barenbrug. The nice thing about the Mojo was that it came coated with a clay coating, so it was much easier to handle in terms of seeding compared with the other 4 varieties listed here. So this is some nitrogen response data with crabgrass, and the reason I'm showing you this is that all of these summer annuals, they take a little bit of management. And I think that was an important thing that John stressed today, is that we can't forget about management, especially when we're using either cool or warm season annuals in grazing systems. So on the x-axis here on the bottom of this graph is nitrogen rate up 0 to 400 pounds. Don't ever put 400 pounds of nitrogen on your crabgrass. This was an experiment. And then this was yield on this from 3 to 10,000 pounds. And as you can see, as we added nitrogen, we got a nice response curve with crabgrass. And this is typical of cool season or warm season annuals. So as we add nitrogen, we're going to increase yield. And it leveled off around 305 pounds of nitrogen. So that's the maximum rate of nitrogen that it responded to. Don't ever put 305 pounds of nitrogen on your crabgrass. You want to be down here on this straight part of the curve, somewhere around 100 to 150 pounds applied as a split application. That's a pretty solid recommendation for most of our summer annual grasses. The point is that we do really respond to nitrogen fertility with our annual grasses. Forage quality is kind of where crabgrass really excels at, and we do a test called in vitro true digestibility with these forages. That's where we take that forage material, we take rumen fluid out of the rumen of the animal, and we have cows that have big rubber plugs in their side, and we pull rumen fluid out of there, and then we put that forage in that rumen fluid, and we measure what those microbes in that rumen fluid break down. And we had in vitro digestibility of 70 to 90% in some of these crabgrass samples from these trials. Crude protein ranged from 6 to 14%. 6% was at the end of the growing season when it was senescing and running out of nitrogen in those fields. In season, we would expect to have 10 to 14%. One of the neat things about summer annuals is we tend to increase crude protein concentration as nitrogen fertilization increases. So as we added a little bit more nitrogen to these crabgrass varieties, we tend to increase crude protein concentration in these crabgrass varieties. That's a very common trait with summer grasses, including Bermuda grass. If you're going to have Bermuda grass in a grazing system, we've got to manage that Bermuda grass, and that means putting some nitrogen on to keep that crude protein concentration higher during the summer months. This is a nice summary of data. It was put together by R.L. Dalrymple, who is retired. He was at the Noble Foundation in Ardmore, Oklahoma. Did a lot of work with crabgrass over the years, and what he found on what he called medium quality crabgrass, he would get 1 pound in 0.8 a day average daily gain on stocker calves, and this is averaged over many growing seasons in many groups of calves. Where crabgrass really excelled at is in a head-to-head competition with Bermuda grass, where Bermuda grass gave stalker calves about a pound of average daily gain, and the crabgrass had about a pound and 3/4 a day. So the quality is really there. Where's crabgrass fit into a system at? You know, if you've got brood cows that you're trying to get through the summer, Bermuda grass is fine. If you've got animals that are lactating, or you're trying to finish those animals during the summer months, crabgrass is really a good choice because it provides a higher quality forage during the summer months compared with Bermuda grass. This is some nitrate data. We measured nitrate accumulation on these trials that we did with nitrogen fertilization. And as you can see, when we put more than about 100 pounds of nitrogen on at one time, we quickly got out of the generally safe range with nitrate accumulation in crabgrass. The interesting thing about this trial is we compared two different nitrogen sources. This dotted line is ammonium nitrate, and ammonium nitrate is all immediately available to the plant, and that drives up nitrate accumulation very quickly in that plant. Broiler litter is a slower nitrogen release, so it has to be mineralized over the growing season. And even when we put a lot of nitrogen on in terms of plant available nitrogen that first growing season with broiler litter, we never accumulated nitrates in the crabgrass forage, and this was very consistent over years in this trial. So we've got that kind of that slow release nitrogen in that broiler litter. All right, I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about some other summer annual forages. Yep, sure. Okay, so Jonathan's asking about how do you get crabgrass into a system if you're predominantly in a cool season grass system. Normally it comes, and we can shift the composition of a cool season pasture like tall fescue towards crabgrass by grazing it hard in late spring and early summer, and then applying a little bit of fertilizer towards that crabgrass. And generally that will stimulate crabgrass. We did a really neat study this year where we had some different defoliation regimes. I'm not going to show the data today, but we had a defoliation where we cut to 1 inch every week, and then 4 inches every week, and then 4 inches once a month. And what we found when we started this, we started with a complete tall fescue sod. By the time we got 5 weeks into the trial, we had shifted the composition to almost all crabgrass, where we defoliated to a 1 inch height on a weekly basis. So just changing your management will help incorporate crabgrass. Now, crabgrass is what we call a species of opportunity, so it doesn't take a tall fescue pasture over. It finds a space in a tall fescue pasture. If there's no space in your pasture because you're managing for that cool season grass, it's going to be very difficult to get crabgrass in there. Where it works best is in a thin pasture, where it's got about a 6 inch opening that it can get started in. If you've got about a 6 inch spot in that pasture, it will come in and fill in. There's a couple different ways to establish crabgrass. Probably the best way, if you want to get a good crabgrass pasture going, is a little bit of light tillage that disturbs the soil, and then broadcast that crabgrass in late spring and put a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer on it, and it's going to come on and kind of fill that space in where it's got an opportunity to grow. Is there any other questions about crabgrass? I think it needs to be a little bit more aggressive than just an aerator. Maybe some kind of a pasture drag or a light disking would be good to disturb the soil. You want to get probably, I would say, 70 to 80% disturbance on the soil to get a good crabgrass stand. You would then broadcast that seed on and cultipack it, and once it rains, you should get a pretty good stand. So seeding depth is very shallow with crabgrass, so no-till drills can work, but they commonly put the seed too deep. Crabgrass likes to have a seeding depth of no deeper than a 1/4 inch. All right, let's talk a little bit about some more traditional summer annuals, and that's the sorghum species, things like Sudan grass hybrids and sorghum Sudan grass, and a little bit about pearl millet, and kind of how they fit into forage systems. And I want to share some data with you that we've done over the last 10 years or so. It focuses on how we choose summer annual varieties to incorporate into forage programs. In the past, we've always said, you know, find a reasonably priced variety and focus on management. And that's a good recommendation in terms of management. Summer annuals, really, to get the most out of them, we've got to manage those varieties, and that means grazing management and agronomic management in terms of fertilization. Hurts my heart to drive through the countryside and see somebody that went to the expense to plant a summer annual, and it's sitting in that field, it's yellow and just not growing because it needs a little bit of nitrogen on it. So, so management's extremely important. But some of the work I'm going to show you is going to kind of challenge this old recommendation of just finding a locally available, reasonably priced variety. So when I was in Virginia, we started doing summer annual trials in the early 2000s, but it wasn't until later that we started to really look at digestibility of these different summer annual varieties, and that's kind of what I want to talk about. When we consider choosing a summer annual variety, we need to look at more than just yield. We need to be looking at digestibility too, in choosing varieties that have a good digestibility. In these trials, we looked at sorghum Sudan grass, forage sorghum in some cases, and pearl millet in these summer annual trials. Pretty standard management, 75 pounds of nitrogen at seeding, and then after each cutting or harvest, we would apply an additional 60 pounds of nitrogen, except for the last harvest. And this was the first harvest results for the summer annual variety trial in 2009. And we had 20-some varieties in here. I'm only showing 6 varieties. I chose 2 from the top, 2 from the bottom performing, and 2 that were kind of in the middle of the pack. We had a number of different species in here. We've got a forage sorghum, a sorghum Sudan grass, and then a pearl millet species in here. Some had what we call the BMR trait, or the brown midrib trait, and some did not. If you're not familiar with that trait, it's where it's a phenotypic expression of something that's different in that plant. The midrib of this leaf actually is a brown or a tan color, and that indicates something that's different inside that plant, and that's the level of lignin in that plant. So the BMR trait or brown midrib trait, these species have lower levels of lignin. Lignin is something that causes fiber in that plant to be less digestible in the rumen of the animal. So lower levels of lignin mean increased digestibility, and that transforms into increased animal performance. So some had the BMR trait, some did not have the BMR trait. When we looked at first harvest yields, what was interesting was the range. So these were all planted on the same day and harvested for that first harvest the same time period. We had a range in yield of 3,800 pounds to 6,800 pounds in this first year that we measured the adjustability. So a huge range in yield. But what was even more interesting was the range in digestibility. So this is this in vitro true digestibility. That's when we take that forage and put it in rumen fluid from the animal and measure what disappears or what's digested by the microbes. We had a range of 54 to 74%. So when I got that data back from the lab, I said to myself, well, certainly the one that's lower in digestibility, that 54%, is going to be the one that yielded the most in the trial. It's going to be the most mature, the most stem to it, and so on. And lo and behold, when we matched that up, some of the highest producing varieties in the trial were also some of the most digestible. And that kind of really got me interested in this relationship between yield and digestibility in these summer annuals. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. This just kind of describes the data set that we're working with over a 6-year period. And the number of entries we had, the number of entries that had the BMR trait, and the number of entries that had the non-BMR trait, and then where this BMR mutation occurred in the plant. So what we did was we started to look at this relationship between yield and digestibility, and this is the data from 2009. And what you can see and there'll be several graphs set up like this. This is in vitro true digestibility listed here. So that's how much of the plant, the dry matter that the microbes could digest. And then on the bottom was the yield. And what we see when we graph the yield against the digestibility for 2009 is that we had no relationship. So it was essentially just like a shotgun on that relationship between yield and digestibility. And we went through and did this, and again in 2010, no relationship between yield and digestibility. 2011, we had a negative relationship. We had another negative relationship in 2012, and a weak relationship in 2014. And then in 2015, again, no relationship between yield and digestibility. So to kind of summarize this data, the relationship varied from year to year with yield and digestibility. We had no relationship in 3 of the 6 years. We had 2 years with a negative relationship and 1 year with kind of a weak negative relationship. We don't understand all the factors impacting this relationship. It could have been influenced by the varieties that were in the trials each year. It could have been influenced by weather. We're not sure exactly what's going on here. What we are sure of is we need to be looking for outliers. So what I mean by an outlier is these varieties that have both high yield and high digestibility. Those are the varieties that we really want to be incorporating into a forage program. Just talk a little bit about the impact of the BMR trait on dry matter yield. As you can see, generally speaking, the BMR trait, varieties with the BMR trait, which would be the darker bar, had a lower yield in 4 of the 6 years. 2 years they had a similar yield. So there's a little bit of a yield drag with BMR. Now remember, these bars are averaged over all the BMR varieties. The black bar is all the BMR varieties in that particular year, and the gray bar are all the non-BMR varieties in that particular year. So when we looked at the yield range within the BMR trait, we saw, for example, in 2009, the minimum yield of varieties that had the BMR trait was 5,200 pounds. The maximum yield was 8,200 pounds. The point that I want to make with this, and this held true for each year, is there's a large range even within the BMR varieties in terms of yield. So some BMR varieties just had a better yield than other BMR varieties. So it's important that we don't just select a variety that has BMR stamped on the outside of the bag. You actually want to look at the yield and the digestibility of individual varieties. This was a very strong relationship with the BMR trait, and what we found over the years, this is in vitro digestibility on the x-axis and then the years of the trials. Every year we had a positive impact on digestibility when we had the BMR trait in that forage. Every year 3 to 5% consistently, and again this is averaged over BMR varieties. In non-BMR varieties, the gray bar. When we looked at the range in digestibility within a given year in traits, for example, this BMR trait in 2009, we had a range in digestibility of 15% in this particular year. And if you look at these other years, it's normally 10 or 12% difference in digestibility, even within the BMR trait. So what that's telling me is that just selecting a BMR variety, we may not be getting the most digestible forage. So we really need to think about going down to the variety level and looking at digestibility and yield at the varietal level. So anyways, we collected all this data over this 6-year period, and we put them in spreadsheets like this, and we ranked them different ways by yield or by digestible yield and so forth. And we take this to meetings and we hand it to producers and say, here you go. And they look at it and say, boy, that's nice. And then that's the last time they ever looked at it. There was literally thousands of data points in these spreadsheets. And so one of my objectives was to get this in a form that producers could actually look at and see, that's a variety that I want to try in my forage program. And that's kind of what we did with this graph. So this looks at yield and digestibility, and we index it against the average for the trial. So for example, on the bottom here we have yield difference from average. So 0 would be the average yield for this trial. So we can rank all the varieties as either being above average in yield or below average in yield. And on the y-axis is in vitro digestibility. So 0 for this trial, and then we rank varieties as being more digestible than average or less digestible than average. And that allows us to kind of break this graph up into 4 pieces. So we've got down here in the lower left-hand quadrant, varieties that have below average yield and below average digestibility. Those are varieties you probably don't want to put into a forage program. Up here is where we really need to be looking. We want to look at varieties in this upper right-hand quadrant. They have above average yield and above average digestibility. These are varieties that you might want to consider putting in a forage program, especially if you have high-producing animals like dairy animals that are lactating, or calves that you just weaned that you want to put a little weight on with some forages, or if you're finishing livestock animals that are have a high energy need. These would be good varieties for those groups of animals. So we did this for each year of the trial, and then each year of the trial we pulled out those varieties that were kind of in this upper right-hand corner. And we started to track that. And this is just some graphs from over the years. I'm not going to go through each one. And we tracked those varieties. Some years we had 8 or 10 varieties in that upper right-hand quadrant. Some years we had less. And we kind of went through this and listed all these varieties over the years, and then summarize them in a table like this. So this is a summary of varieties that have above average yield and digestibility. And we have all the varieties that ever tested above average and yield digestibility listed here. And then the trial, the years that they did it in. What we really want to start looking for is these varieties that tested more than 1 year with above average yield and digestibility. So when we start to see varieties that have 3 or 4 years of data with above average yield and digestibility, these are really varieties that are robust and that we want to include in a forage program if we possibly can. And I have all this summarized in an article that that's available on our UK Forages website. So the take-home points is that the relationship between yield and digestibility varied depending on year. BMR trait consistently increased digestibility, even averaged over all the BMR varieties. There was a large range in digestibility within the BMR trait, so some BMR varieties are more digestible than others. BMR trait in general was negatively correlated with yield, and again, a large variation in yield even within the BMR varieties. So that means there are some BMR varieties that tend to have a higher yield than other BMR varieties. We didn't show this data, but no BMR gene or mutation appeared to be superior over the one. Most of the ones available will be the 6 mutation. So we want to start to choose varieties that did consistently well over multiple years. So not just 1 year, but when we start to see 2 or 3 or 4 years of above average performance, those are very robust varieties. And the last thing is the final take home from this section is that we want to consider both yield and digestibility when we think about selecting summer annuals for our program. So if you're buying seed, ask your seed guys, do you have digestibility data on your varieties? And hopefully they'll have some for you. I want to take just a minute and show you, this is a newer study. I've got a graduate student working on this, and this is looking at summer annual diversity. Yep. So like, are you talking like NDF digestibility? I don't know. I've always focused on the in vitro true digestibility. I've never really graphed out the neutral detergent fiber digestibility. I don't know, is John still here? I'm sure there'd be some relationship, but I'm not sure exactly. Yeah. 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 Mhm. Because of the, right, yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Well, we have that data. We could probably go back and look at that. Yeah, that's a good point. Right. Okay. Let me tell you just a little bit about a study. One of the interesting things now is looking at some of these diverse cover crop mixtures and diverse mixtures and forage systems. And I had a graduate student who was interested in this, and she'll be finishing up this year. And she did a study looking at summer annual diversity, and its impact on animal performance was her primary focus. And she's come up with some interesting data, and she's got another interesting study that this one kind of led into. I'm not going to show any data on that today, but we will be presenting some data at the American Forage and Grassland Council meeting, which will be here in Greenville. And that's looking at nitrogen fertilization of summer annual mixtures. Um, I think when it comes to nitrogen fertilization, what we observed was that sometimes we don't put enough nitrogen on these mixtures, these complex mixtures. And she's got some nice data to illustrate that. So, look real quick on our materials and methods. This is a random complete block design with 3 replications. So this was a replicated study, not a demonstration. We had 3 levels of diversity in there. We had a monoculture, so that means just one thing, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute. And then we had a simple mixture, and those are several things that you could just go to the farm store and buy. And then we had a very diverse mixture, which had 11 different species of forages in that mixture. We planted in late spring. We stocked our pastures, depending on the year, in late July or very early August. Our animals were fall-born calves, and they were a little bit bigger, about 600 pounds, and maybe a little bit bigger in 2019. And we stocked the pastures with 6 of those animals, and those were our tester animals. In 2017, our pastures were twice as big, so we added some cows to kind of help keep the forage under control as best we could. We grazed for about 60 days, and then we weighed the animals at the beginning and at the end of the study, and then we calculated average daily gains. And along the way, we clipped samples for yield, nutritive value, and botanical composition. And then Kelly came in, much to her dismay, and she took soil cores for root samples. And she separated the root samples out. We're not going to talk about that data today, which is extremely tedious to wash and pick roots out of soil cores. So not her favorite part of the study per se. So we had 3 mixtures that we used. We had a monoculture, and that was a BMR sorghum Sudan grass from Alta Seeds. We had a simple mixture, and that was that BMR sorghum Sudan, pearl millet, and just a soybean. So all things you could get at the farm store. And then we had a very complex mixture. We had a sorghum Sudan, pearl millet, a soybean. We had a Sudan grass in there, a crabgrass. We had sun hemp, a tropical legume. We had annual espadiza, which is a warm season annual legume. We had cowpeas, rape and radish in there, and even a little bit of corn in this mixture. So a pretty crazy mixture. We call it Kelly's Crazy Mix, and it was cool. So I really enjoyed seeing that mixture and the diversity in that mixture, and it was surprising. Everything was there. All the species that we planted were in that mixture. A lot of them were in very minor components of the botanical composition, but everything showed up. This is Kelly clipping samples in her study. She clipped samples and then separated those samples by species into the different botanical components, which was very tedious also. Dried it, weighed it, did nutritive value on it too, and we'll show you just a little bit of that data today. And again, all 12 species were present in this very complex mixture. This was the biomass production, and this was from 2017. And when we started grazing, it was around 4,000 pounds, and then we had to make the decision of how we were going to manage grazing on this. We had pretty large paddocks, and we had one water source at the end of each paddock, so we decided to strip graze away from the water source. And by the time we got done strip grazing in mid-August with this particular study, we had increased biomass up to 6 to 7 tons. So what am I trying to tell you? By the time we were done, the summer annuals were out of control, and that's a common problem with summer annuals, especially if you're not stocked high enough. They can get out of control pretty easily, and each one of those paddocks were stocked with 6 calves that weighed about 600 pounds, and then 3 to 4 cows. So this is the botanical composition, and this is exactly what you would expect from the monoculture. So that only had BMR sorghum Sudan grass in it. 100% of that mixture essentially was made up of that sorghum Sudan grass. The simple mixture, again, was dominated by that sorghum Sudan grass, and the other species, the pearl millet, soybean, and weeds made a relatively minor contribution to that. So again, sorghum Sudan grass is very dominant in mixtures. It gets up quick and can shade out other species within that mixture. This is where it got kind of interesting at. When we had this very complex mixture, the botanical composition, we had about 60% sorghum Sudan grass in it when we actually clipped the samples and separated them into different species. And about 40% of that mixture was made up of different things. So crabgrass and pearl millet and corn and cowpeas and so forth. You'll notice not all 11 species are on this graph because a lot of them were very minor component in the biomass, in the botanical composition, and they were all close to that 0 to 2%. And it kind of made the graph kind of messy towards the bottom. But everything was present in these pastures. So what I want to point out is that 40% of this biomass is coming from something other than sorghum Sudan grass here. I don't know. That's a good question. And maybe one I'll pose to Kelly when we get back, and she can kind of group them by functional group, potentially, and look at legumes and then broadleafs also within that mixture. All right, so now let's get to the real meat of this, and that's how these animals performed on this. And I'm showing you 2 years of data here. This is average daily gain data, and the exact opposite happened of what we hypothesized in this particular study. We hypothesized that animals on this diverse mixture would do the best, and they didn't. They did the worst in both years. The magnitude of the differences from year 1 and year 2 were different, but the trends on how the animals performed were the same. And if we look at the complex mixture, which is the third bar, we thought we had this data put in backwards when we did this the first year. We were convinced we put the data in wrong, and when we went back and looked, it was right. And we got the same trend in performance both years. Why is this happening? You know, we don't know for sure. Kelly's going to tease that out in the next 6 months when she prepares her dissertation. But what we think is happening is that we took something that was highly digestible in terms of brown midrib sorghum Sudan grass, and we replaced it with other things that were pretty cool, but were not as digestible, like a sunflower. You know, so the big question comes to be: do we throw these mixtures out and say just don't use them? And I think the answer is probably no. I mean, I think they have some benefits past animal performance, right? So we're increasing diversity in that mixture. So all of a sudden we made habitat for different kind of pollinating insects because we have some flowering plants in there like sun hemp and sunflowers, and we've got different types of vegetation at different levels within that mixture, which is making habitat for other things. And so what if they don't graze some of it? If they trample some of it on the ground and it makes habitat for other things like earthworms that live in the soil and bacteria and fungi that are breaking them down, that's all an important part of the ecosystem. So, but the one thing I want to stress is that sometimes when we talk about these mixtures and we see people get up and they get all excited about these mixtures, a lot of that's not based on data. It's kind of what they want to see. And sometimes when we really take a hard look at these mixtures based on data, they're not exactly what we had first anticipated, like that average daily gain data. So it's important to keep that in mind as we move forward. So one of the questions that I wanted to answer today, somebody's got to keep me on track in terms of time. Kirsten, if you could watch my time for me, is where do these summer annuals kind of fit into grazing systems at? And I always like to say that I think a profitable grazing system is going to be based on well-adapted perennial sods, and that are complemented, just like John talked about, with some of these annuals to kind of fill these gaps in. And I think that's kind of where summer annuals fit in. Yeah. No, the calves went away to the stock market at the end of the season. And then we got another set of calves, same genetics from the farm, same set of cows produced those calves, but they were a different set of calves that second year. Rainfall was pretty good in the second year of the study. We had a period in August that was a little bit dry that reduced growth of the summer annuals. And that probably caused our difference in magnitude that second year. All right, so I think an important place for summer annuals and grazing systems is part of a renovation cycle. A lot of times we get trapped in this idea that we should be using the same pasture for 30 years in a row. And when we do that, we often miss out on improved forage genetics. There's a lot of great new and improved grass varieties and legume varieties out there, and we kind of miss out on that when we don't renovate pastures enough. And I think summer annuals can be an important part of this renovation cycle. And a good example of that is novel endophyte tall fescue. And we've got John here that's a leader in the Tall Fescue Alliance. And in the animal performance is so much higher on these novel endophytes that we need to be working to try to get them into grazing systems. And summer annuals gives us a good vehicle to try to get these improved cultivars into grazing systems. And it kind of works like this. We could identify a weak pasture in need of renovation, and then maybe this winter we feed hay in that pasture. It's going to bring organic matter into that pasture. It's going to bring some nutrients into that pasture. We move our hay feeding points around a little bit to get a better nutrient distribution like John was talking about. And then we come in there in the spring, we soil test and amend as needed. So if we need some lime or fertilizer, we get it on that pasture. We spray it with a non-selective herbicide before it goes to seed in the spring. And then we plant a summer annual mixture. And we can graze or harvest that summer annual mixture. And then we spray it one more time in the fall and come back into a perennial forage species like an improved tall fescue variety. So the important part is that we're using this summer annual as a means of renovating these pastures. We don't have to do the whole farm at once. We just do a field. We do the weakest field that we have, maybe where we fed hay at in the winter months, or a field that's kind of played out over time. Wanted to mention this. I'll probably get thrown out of South Carolina for even bringing it up, but this is something that many of us deal with on farms, and that's what I call perennial Suex or Johnson grass, and it's not an annual, but it is in warm season grass that we often find in pastures. And the question is what do we do with it? It is a sorghum species. It spreads by seeds and rhizomes commonly found on old dairy farms or in bottomland. And it thrives when it's grazed and then rested. So under hay management, it does very well. One of the frustrating things about Johnson grass is that if you have it in a pasture and then you implement a rotational stocking system in that pasture, it can get worse under rotational stocking because we're grazing it and we're resting it. And it really likes that kind of management. We don't find it in continuously grazed pastures because every time it comes up, the animals are right there to graze it off during the summer months, and we eventually deplete carbohydrate reserves in the roots and cause it to be grazed out in continuously stocked pastures. Does respond to nitrogen fertilization, good quality if managed. We want to harvest the boot stage, and it can have issues with prussic acid and nitrates like other sorghum species. If you got one of those Southern Forages books today, you'll notice that when in the beginning of the book where we have different forage species adapted to the southeastern United States, Johnson grass is listed as a forage species in that book. This was just an interesting piece of data that I wanted to show you from the Noble Foundation. It looked at the nutritive value of warm season grasses, top 10 grasses in nutritive value. And look who's at the top, Johnson grass. This was done in an article from the Noble Foundation, Ardmore, Oklahoma. I'm just showing you this because sometimes we deal with these things on farms, and the best solution may not be to pull your hair out trying to kill everything if you can manage it and make it part of your system. And the same holds true with common Bermuda grass. In some cases can work to meet summer forage needs if it's already occurring in your pastures and you just change your management to optimize its production. You need to wick it with glyphosate then. So in a pasture, that's about how you're going to get rid of it is an application of Roundup to that Johnson grass, and you can actually wick it so it doesn't touch any of your other plants within the pasture. Pray, don't buy hay from them and bring that seed in. So I don't think Johnson grass seed would blow as much as other seed. I think it would be probably transported more in hay. But you'll have to keep after it. You'll probably never get rid of it. Good. So outrider herbicide for Bermuda grass pastures can help control Johnson grass. All right, I just want to finish things up and talk a little bit about conserved forage because I think this species has some opportunities. We did a study a number of years back looking at drought in forage systems and looking at the potential of mixing corn and sorghum together to improve the drought tolerance of late planted silage crops. This was how the drought set up in Kentucky in 2012, which was a very bad drought year in Kentucky also. And I put this on here to remind me that drought is part of our agricultural landscape. If we look at the drought monitor for this last week, this is what Kentucky looked like. We're pretty much in a severe drought. Got a little bit of rain this weekend, about an inch and a half of rain, so we're very fortunate for that. A little bit closer to home, this is what the drought monitor looks like for South Carolina. And again, in the western part of the state, you've got some areas with extreme drought in them, abnormally dry, and then some severe drought also. The point is that as much as we want to ignore drought, it's here to stay. And it's part of our agricultural system, and we need to design forage systems that are going to be very resilient in the face of, in the face of droughts and limited soil moisture. So we kind of put the study together where we looked at planting corn alone or forage sorghum alone or mixing corn and forage sorghum together. And what we did was we planted a regular standard seeding rate of corn, and then we added 2, 4, 6, or 8 pounds of forage sorghum to that mixture. We used a dwarf forage sorghum called AF7401. It's the BMR dwarf forage sorghum. and we put 100 pounds of nitrogen on at seeding, and we seeded it in late May to kind of simulate a late silage seeding in the Piedmont region of Virginia. And then we harvested when the forage sorghum reached the soft dough stage. And it looked pretty miserable. So those plants in this mixture, the plants with their leaves kind of broad and out are sorghum plants, so showing no signs of drought stress. But our corn plants were all curled up. It got pretty dry in 2010. Our seed companies came and everything looked pretty miserable at that point in time. Our fescue was getting brown and crispy underneath your feet there in the background. But the seed company guys were pretty supportive. They said, no, this is what we want to see. We want to see how this sorghum produces under moisture stress conditions. So this was the data from the first year we did this study, and this was the corn alone, had about 10,000 pounds of adjusted silage yield. Just by adding 4 pounds of forage sorghum to that, we doubled that in the first year of the study. When we did this again in 2011, we tripled the yield adding 4 pounds of forage sorghum to that corn. So it really improved the drought tolerance of that silage just adding that forage sorghum. That's one of the benefits of forage sorghum, is it's just much more drought tolerant than corn. It's a different type of drought tolerance. Forage sorghum will stop growing and kind of wait on rain. Corn doesn't do that. Corn will get 5 feet tall, and if it's time to go reproductive, it's going to put a tassel up and not form an ear because it's under a drought stress. Forage sorghum will wait on that rain. And this is an important drought management tool for silage systems in the southeastern United States. Where it's always kind of fell short in terms of forage sorghum has been animal performance. This was a summary article that was done in a number of years ago that looked at animal performance on a BMR 6 forage sorghum versus corn. And what was interesting in the balanced ration, when we had a BMR 6 forage sorghum, only one time was milk yield different, milk production different than corn. All the other times it was equal to or better than corn production. So this is just illustrating that these new BMR forage sorghums that are more digestible are going to have a better feed value than our older conventional forage sorghums, which is that first column. So where's forage sorghum fit into systems at? I don't think it's going to replace corn, and it shouldn't replace corn, but we could use it in mixtures as insurance with corn, or maybe planting alternating rows of corn and forage sorghum. Best fit is going to be on drouthy soils that are kind of marginal for corn silage production. Arid regions or regions prone to short-term drought stress. There are regions within every state that just get a little bit less rainfall, and that may be a good place for a forage sorghum in a system. I had a good friend in Red House, Virginia, Mr. Bennett, and Mr. Bennett said that Red House is so dry that during Noah's great flood they got 2 inches. So, and it's interesting, when you did look at a precipitation map for Virginia, there was a little dot over Red House, Virginia. I don't know why, if it's just the way the landscape was, but it was a little bit drier in that area of the state. All right, and then for delayed or late silage plantings, it may be a really good fit. All right, I just want to finish up and show you a couple of resources we have at University of Kentucky. We've got a great new improved forage site. Just search UKY forages and it'll pop right up. Will be the first thing on the top of the list. We've got a great YouTube channel. We've got hundreds of videos on here of all kinds of different presentations. If you're interested in this, you just search KY Forages YouTube and it'll pop right up. This is just a presentation that was on there from the AFGC meeting several years ago. Got a great variety testing program, probably one of the most extensive in the United States. And if you're interested in varieties, there's lots of publications on there, summarized different ways, but this is what you want to look at, the long-term summary of variety trials. And that shows you how varieties have performed across years. And that's important, that we choose varieties that have performed not good in just one year, but over multiple years. And then if you're interested in getting a newsletter, you can simply go to our forages page and click right here and put your email in, and then every month at the beginning of the month, and we're very timely about that, you'll get a forage newsletter. in electronic version. And then that's it. So, yep. So are there any questions? Everybody's tired after lunch. Yep. Yeah. So I wouldn't have expected that. And I remember John, I think John sent that email around. And I don't have a good explanation. I don't know if John, generally we don't expect legumes to be high in nitrates because they make their own nitrogen, but they get lazy when there's a presence of large amounts of nitrogen in the soil, and that's what could have caused that nitrate accumulation. Did you see negative impacts on the animal when you had that situation? That's interesting too, because those were pretty high nitrate levels, if I remember correctly. So that's almost nuclear nitrates. And yeah, that's pretty high. We generally figure generally safe is below 5,000 parts per million. So we took soil samples and we're sending them to Dr. Franz Luber's in North Carolina at the USDA to um, look at microbial biomass in the soil from Kelly's study. But we need more of that type of work, and that's a whole nother issue in terms of looking at it. It's not quite as simple as people make it out to be when you start really looking at microbial species within the soil, even grouping bacteria and fungi in the soil. So we definitely need more work in that area. We need more whole systems of work on the impact of these diverse mixtures on the ecology of the soil. Yeah, I think that's definitely a benefit of using not only mixtures but just good pasture management is to increase organic matter in the soils. I'm not an organic matter expert. Maybe John Andre is an organic matter expert. Or my in organic matter is not quite as straightforward as we make it out to be either. We've got organic matter that ranges from stuff that we just put on the soil to stable organic matter, and there's all kinds of fractions in between. But there's no question in my mind that increase in organic matter in the soil is going to increase productivity of those pastures. And that happens with good grazing management. We often make like that's something that's new, but all along, if we have good fertility in our pastures, we've got good pasture productivity, we've got a good grazing cycle and resting those plants and cycling those roots through through grazing and then resting those plants, we're going to increase organic matter in those pastures. So this is not necessarily new. We're just starting to realize the positive effects that good grazing management has on pastures. Yeah. We'll never reach 8%. Yeah. So this all goes back, and we talk about grazing management. What we're talking about making habitat for different things that live on the soil surface. Did a very interesting study. Do you have 2 minutes? So did a very interesting study with that defoliation this summer, and one of the primary things we were looking at with this defoliation study, where we cut these tall fescue sods to 1 inch weekly, was the impact that a 1 inch defoliation had versus a 4 inch defoliation had on soil temperature. And the impact on hot days was dramatic. It was 15 degrees difference on some of the hottest days. So think about that. We're modifying that microclimate right at the soil surface, and that's going to impact all those things that live right at the soil surface, earthworms and bacteria and fungi and insects that are breaking this organic matter down and bringing it back into the nutrient cycle. So how we manage that grazing is going to can have an impact on the microclimate, and then have an impact on all these other things that live in the soil too. All right. I think I'm done. Thank you for your attention. I really enjoyed it.